Every day, the quiet janitor swept the hospital halls unnoticed until a young Marine paused, eyes fixed on the faded tattoo on his wrist. "Sir, were you in Vietnam?" he asked, and suddenly, decades of silence threatened to break. The VA hospital was a world of routines. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. The scent of antiseptic and coffee mingled in the air, and the steady hum of machines provided a backdrop for the daily shuffle of veterans, nurses, and visitors. Most people barely noticed the janitor in the blue uniform, moving quietly from ward to ward with his mop and cart. He was always early, always silent, always thorough. His name tag read Frank, but few bothered to look. He'd been there for years, blending into the background, a fixture as constant as the linoleum floors he polished. The nurses appreciated his reliability. The doctors nodded politely. The veterans sometimes offered a tired smile or a word of thanks, but no one asked about the man behind the mop. Frank liked it that way. He'd learned long ago that silence was safer. Stories had a way of leaking pain, and he'd spent decades trying to keep his wounds sealed. So he swept, he mopped, he fixed leaky faucets and replaced burnt-out bulbs. He listened to the world's noise but never added to it. But on a Tuesday afternoon, as Frank was wiping fingerprints from the glass doors near the physical therapy wing, he felt a presence beside him. He glanced up to see a young Marine, maybe 22, in crisp dress blues. The Marine's eyes were sharp, his posture perfect, but there was a nervous energy about him like he was searching for something. Frank offered a polite nod, expecting the Marine to move on. Instead, the young man lingered, gaze dropping to Frank's wrist as he reached for his rag. There, just above the cuff, was a faded dragon tattoo, its colors washed out, the lines blurred by time and age. "Sir, were you in Vietnam?" the Marine asked, voice low but clear. Frank froze. The question hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. For a moment, he considered brushing it off, offering a non-committal answer. But something in the Marine's ease, a mix of respect and longing, made him pause. "Yes," Frank replied quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "A long time ago." The Marine's face lit up with recognition and admiration. "My grandfather served there. He used to tell me stories about the jungle, the heat, the brotherhood. He said the dragon tattoo was a sign of someone who'd seen real combat." Frank looked down at his wrist, memories flickering like old film reels. "Your grandfather was right. It meant you'd been through the worst and made it home." The Marine nodded, then extended his hand. "Corporal Jami Studner, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines." "It's an honor, sir." Frank hesitated, then shook the young man's hand. The grip was firm, respectful. For a brief moment, Frank felt the old pride stir, a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. They stood in silence, the world around them fading. Frank saw flashes of his past, the chopper blades thumping overhead, the thick jungle heat, the faces of friends lost and found. He wondered how much to share, how much to keep locked away. James broke the silence. "If you don't mind me asking, sir, what was it like?" "My grandfather never talked much about it." Frank considered the question. He saw the hunger in the Marine's eyes, not just for stories, but for understanding, for connection. He remembered being young, searching for meaning in the words of older men. "It was hard," Frank said finally. "Harder than I can explain. But there were good moments too. Brotherhood, courage, the kind of loyalty you don't find anywhere else." James nodded, his expression serious. "I think I understand, at least a little." Frank smiled, a small, sad smile. "Maybe one day you will. I hope you never have to." A nurse called for James, and the moment broke. The Marine straightened, saluted, and hurried down the hall. Frank watched him go, a strange mix of pride and sorrow twisting in his chest. As he returned to his work, Frank noticed something different. The halls felt less empty, the silence less oppressive. For the first time in years, someone had seen him, not just the janitor, but the man he used to be. That evening, as Frank finished his shift and stepped out into the cool dusk, he found himself thinking about the past. The memories he'd tried so hard to bury began to surface. The friends he'd lost, the promises he'd made, the moments of fear and bravery that had shaped his life. He walked home slowly, the city's lights twinkling in the distance. In his small apartment, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at his wrist. The dragon tattoo seemed brighter somehow, as if the simple question, "Sir, were you in Vietnam?" had brought it back to life. Frank poured himself a cup of coffee and sat in silence. He thought about the young Marine, about the generations that had come after him, about the stories left untold. He wondered if it was time to start sharing, if not for himself, then for those who still searched for meaning in the shadows of old wars. He reached for a pen and a blank notebook, the pages crisp and inviting. Slowly, hesitantly, he began to write. "My name is Frank. I was in Vietnam. This is my story." Word count for part 1. Approximately 1,000. Frank's nights were always the hardest. He'd returned from the hospital to his small, sparsely furnished apartment, the silence pressing in like fog. Sometimes he'd flip through old letters tucked in a shoebox, yellowed paper. faded ink, memories of a life lived in another world. He rarely slept through the night. Dreams of the jungle, the thunder of artillery, the faces of friends lost and never found haunted him, but something had shifted since his encounter with Corporal James Turner. The young Marine's question echoed in his mind, stirring embers Frank thought had long gone cold. For the first time in years, he felt compelled to remember, not just the pain, but the moments of courage, of laughter, of brotherhood. The next day at the hospital, Frank moved through his routine with a new awareness. He noticed things he'd overlooked before, the way the veterans in the waiting room sat with their backs straight, the way nurses gently touched a trembling hand, the quiet nods exchanged between men who recognized something familiar in each other's eyes. During his lunch break, Frank sat outside on a bench beneath a scraggly maple tree. The sun was warm, the air filled with the distant sounds of traffic and birdsong. He opened his notebook and wrote about his first days in Vietnam, the heat, the fear, the overwhelming sense of being far from home. He wrote about his best friend, Tommy, who'd taught him to play cards and always had a joke ready. Even in the darkest moments, as he wrote, a voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir, mind if I sit?" Frank looked up to see James, the young Marine, holding a tray with a sandwich and a soda. Frank nodded, gesturing to the empty spot beside him. They ate in companionable silence for a while. Finally, James spoke. "I told my mom about you," he said, "about your tattoo. She said her dad had one just like it. He never talked about the war, either." Frank smiled, a little sadly. "A lot of us didn't. Sometimes it's easier that way." James hesitated. I think it's important to talk. My grandfather passed before I could ask him anything. I wish I knew more." Frank nodded, understanding. "It's not easy, but maybe it's time." James's eyes brightened. Would you tell me a story about Vietnam?" Frank took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past settle on his shoulders. He closed his eyes, remembering the thick, humid air, the sound of insects, the ever-present tension. "There was a night," Frank began, "when everything went wrong. We were on patrol, deep in the jungle. It was supposed to be routine, but nothing ever was. We walked into an ambush. Bullets everywhere. Chaos. My friend Tommy, he got hit. I dragged him behind a fallen tree, patched him up as best I could. We were pinned down for hours. I thought we wouldn't make it." James listened intently, eyes wide. "But we did," Frank continued. "We made it because we stuck together. Because we trusted each other. That's what I remember most. Brotherhood. The way we looked out for each other, no matter what." James was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you for sharing that, sir." Frank smiled. "Call me Frank." James grinned. "Thank you, Frank." After lunch, James returned to his duties, and Frank felt lighter than he had in years. He realized that sharing his story didn't just help James, it helped him, too. That afternoon, as Frank swept the halls, he noticed other veterans watching him with new respect. Word had spread about his tattoo, about his past. Some nodded in silent acknowledgement. Others offered a quiet thank you. Frank accepted it all with humility, grateful for the connection. As the days passed, Frank and James developed a quiet friendship. They met for lunch when their schedules aligned, sharing stories, advice, and the kind of understanding that only comes from shared experience. Frank found himself looking forward to these moments, to the chance to pass on what he'd learned. One evening, as Frank prepared to leave, he found a note tucked into his locker. "Thank you for your service, Frank. Your story matters." James Frank smiled, tucking the note into his pocket. He walked home beneath a sky streaked with pink and gold, feeling for the first time in a long time at peace. He knew the journey wasn't over. There were more stories to tell, more memories to face, more connections to make. But he also knew he wasn't alone. And that, he realized, made all the difference. Frank's days at the VA hospital began to change in subtle, meaningful ways. The quiet camaraderie with James grew into a genuine friendship, and the other staff and veterans started to see Frank in a new light. He was no longer just the janitor. He was a living piece of history, a silent witness to a generation's sacrifice. One morning, as Frank polished the floors near the physical therapy wing, he overheard two older veterans discussing their time in Vietnam. Normally, he would have kept his distance, but today, he paused, mop in hand. "Frank, you ever walk point in the jungle?" One of them asked, a knowing smile on his lips. Frank nodded, a faint grin appearing a few times. "Never got used to it." They laughed, the tension easing. The conversation turned to stories of near misses, lost friends, and the strange comfort found in shared hardship. Frank found himself opening up, recalling the night patrols, the monsoon rains, the moments of fear and courage. Later that week, James invited Frank to join a small group of younger Marines for coffee in the hospital cafeteria. At first, Frank hesitated. He wasn't sure he belonged among these men, so much younger. Their war is so different. But James insisted. "Sir, you've got more to teach us than any manual," he said. Frank relented. The group welcomed him warmly, eager for his stories and advice. They asked about leadership, about surviving the worst days, about coming home. Frank answered honestly, sharing not just the victories but the regrets, the mistakes, the lessons learned through pain. One afternoon, as the group sat together, a nurse approached with a smile. "You know, Frank, you should speak at our Veterans Day event next month. The hospital always invites someone to share their story. You'd be perfect." Frank's first instinct was to refuse. He'd spent decades avoiding the spotlight, content, to let others take center stage. But as he looked around at the eager faces, James, the young Marines, the older veterans, he realized his story might help others. Maybe it was time. He agreed, nerves fluttering in his stomach. The weeks leading up to the event passed quickly. Frank spent his evenings at the kitchen table, notebook open, trying to find the right words. He wrote about the fear and the brotherhood, about the jungle and the journey home, about the tattoo on his wrist and what it meant to carry the past into the present. On Veterans Day, the hospital auditorium filled with staff, patients, and families. Frank stood at the podium, hands trembling, heart pounding. He looked out at the crowd, at James, at the Marines, at the nurses and doctors who had become his friends. He began to speak. "I was just a kid when I went to Vietnam. I thought I knew what it meant to be brave. I learned that real courage isn't about never being afraid, it's about doing your duty even when you're terrified. I learned that brotherhood can save your life, and that coming home is sometimes the hardest battle of all." He spoke of the dragon tattoo, of the friends he'd lost, of the years spent in silence. He spoke of the healing he'd found in unexpected places, in a hospital hallway, in a young Marine's question, in the simple act of sharing a story. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause. Frank saw tears in the eyes of veterans and staff alike. James stood and saluted, and others followed. After the event, people approached Frank to thank him, to share their own stories, to ask for advice. Frank listened, offering comfort and understanding. He realized that by breaking his silence, he had given others permission to do the same. That night, as Frank walked home beneath the stars, he felt lighter than he had in years. He knew there would always be pain, always be memories that haunted him, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had found his voice and, in doing so, had helped others find theirs. Winter settled over the city, bringing with it a hush that seemed to seep into every corner of Frank's world. The VA hospital glowed with holiday lights and the gentle bustle of families visiting loved ones. For Frank, the season was always bittersweet, memories of distant Christmases in the jungle, laughter around makeshift fires, the ache of empty bunks. But this year felt different. Since sharing his story at the Veterans Day event, Frank had become something of a quiet legend in the hospital. Nurses and doctors greeted him with new warmth. Veterans stopped him in the halls to swap stories or simply to say thank you. Even the hospital director made a point of shaking his hand, commending him for his courage not just in war, but in breaking the silence that had held so many captive. James, the young Marine, became a regular presence in Frank's life. They met often for lunch, sometimes joined by other young service members eager to hear about the past. Frank found himself mentoring them, offering advice on everything from leadership to coping with loss. He saw in them the same hope and uncertainty he'd once carried, and it filled him with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in decades. One afternoon, as snow began to fall outside, James approached Frank with a request. "Would you come meet my family?" he asked. "My mom would love to thank you in person. She says I talk about you more than anyone else these days." Frank hesitated, but James's earnestness won him over. That weekend, Frank found himself sitting at a kitchen table in a cozy suburban home, surrounded by laughter and the smell of baking cookies. James's mother hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. "You've given my son something he never got from his own grandfather, a sense of connection, of understanding. Thank you." The moment was humbling. Frank realized that his story, once a source of pain, had become a bridge linking generations, healing old wounds. As the months passed, Frank's circle continued to grow. He joined a local veterans writing group where he shared his notebook entries and encouraged others to do the same. The group's weekly meetings became a lifeline for many, a place to turn memories into meaning and pain into purpose. Frank also began volunteering at the hospital's outreach center, helping newly returned veterans navigate the maze of paperwork, benefits, and bureaucracy. He listened to their frustrations, offered practical advice, and, when needed, simply sat in silence with them, reminding them that they weren't alone. One spring morning, the hospital hosted a community event honoring Vietnam veterans. Frank was asked to speak once again, this time to a crowd that included city officials, school children, and families. He stood at the podium, his voice steady, his gaze clear. "I spent years hiding my story, thinking it was safer that way, but I've learned that silence can be its own kind of wound. When we share our stories, we heal not just ourselves, but each other. We remind the world that sacrifice matters, that courage endures, and that hope is always possible." The applause was thunderous. Afterward, a young girl approached him, clutching a notebook. "Will you sign this?" she asked shyly. "My dad says you're a hero." Frank smiled, kneeling to meet her eyes. "We're all heroes in our own way," he said, softly, signing his name with a steady hand. As the years slipped by, Frank continued to find new ways to serve. He organized food drives for homeless veterans, spoke at local schools about the realities of war and the importance of kindness, and mentored young hospital staff. His apartment, once a place of solitude, became a gathering spot for friends, veterans, nurses, neighbors drawn by his quiet wisdom and gentle humor. On the anniversary of the day he'd first spoken with James, Frank hosted a small dinner at his home. The table was crowded with laughter, stories, and the clink of glasses. James, now a sergeant, toasted Frank. "To the man who taught me that real strength is found in honesty, and that healing begins when we let others in." Frank raised his glass, his eyes shining with gratitude. "To friendship, to family, and to the stories that keep us going." That night, as Frank sat by his window watching the city lights twinkle, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the young Marine who'd noticed his tattoo, the friends he'd lost and found, the pain he'd carried, and the peace he'd discovered. He knew that life would always hold challenges, that memories would sometimes return with a sting, but he also knew he was no longer alone. His story had become part of something larger, a tapestry of courage, resilience, and hope. Frank closed his notebook. Content. He had found his voice. He had found his place. And as dawn broke over the city, he smiled, ready for whatever the new day would bring. Spring brought a gentle warmth to the city, and with it, a sense of renewal that seeped into every corner of Frank's life. The VA hospital's gardens bloomed with color, and Frank found himself lingering outside during breaks, breathing in the scent of fresh grass and listening to the distant laughter of children playing in the park across the street. He had never thought of himself as someone who would find peace in such small things, but now he cherished them. One afternoon, as Frank swept the hospital's main entrance, he noticed a group of high school students gathered near the reception desk. Their teacher approached him, smiling. "Mr. Frank, would you mind talking to my class about your service? We're studying the Vietnam War, and I think it would mean a lot for them to hear from someone who lived it." Frank hesitated, nerves fluttering in his stomach, but the eager faces of the students reminded him of James, of the importance of sharing stories. He nodded, setting his mop aside. In the hospital's small conference room, Frank stood before the students, his hands folded. He spoke of his youth, of being drafted, of the fear and camaraderie that defined his time in Vietnam. He described the jungle, the rain, the moments of terror, and the bonds that formed in the mud and heat. He didn't shy away from the hard truths, the losses, the confusion, the struggle to come home and find his place again. The students listened in rapt silence. When he finished, a girl in the front row raised her hand. "Were you scared?" she asked. Frank smiled. "Every day, but I learned that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs to be done, even when you are." Afterward, several students approached to thank him, some with tears in their eyes. Their teacher pressed his hand warmly. "You made history real for them. Thank you." That evening, Frank walked home feeling lighter. He realized that his story, once a burden, had become a bridge connecting generations, inspiring understanding and empathy. As summer approached, Frank's writing group decided to publish a collection of their stories. The project brought the group closer, each member contributing memories, poems, and reflections. Frank's piece about the dragon tattoo, about brotherhood and survival, became the opening chapter. At the book launch, Frank read his story aloud, his voice steady, his heart full. The event drew a crowd: veterans, hospital staff, families, and even local officials. James attended in full uniform, beaming with pride. After the reading, he hugged Frank. "You've changed my life, sir. You've changed a lot of lives." Frank blinked back tears. "So have you, James, so have you." In the months that followed, Frank continued to find new ways to serve. He volunteered at a local food pantry, organized a fundraiser for homeless veterans, and helped launch a mentorship program at the hospital. He became a fixture at community events, always ready with a story or a word of encouragement. One autumn evening, as leaves drifted down from the trees, Frank received a letter from Tommy's sister. She'd read his story in the book and wanted to thank him for keeping Tommy's memory alive. "He always spoke so highly of you," she wrote. "I'm glad you found your voice." Frank sat quietly, the letter trembling in his hands. He thought of Tommy, of the friends he'd lost, of the promises made and kept. He realized that in sharing his story, he had honored them all. The years passed, and Frank grew older, but his spirit remained strong. The hospital staff threw him a retirement party, filling the break room with laughter, cake, and heartfelt speeches. James, now a decorated officer, gave the toast to Frank, the man who taught us that healing is a journey, that stories matter, and that the quietest voices can echo the loudest. Frank smiled, surrounded by friends, family, and the community he had helped build. He looked at the faces around him, young and old, military and civilian, each touched in some way by his journey. That night, as Frank sat on his porch, the city lights twinkling in the distance, he reflected on his life. He thought of the young Marine who had noticed his tattoo, the students who had listened to his story, the veterans who had found hope in his words. He realized that his journey had come full circle, not an end, but a new beginning. He picked up his notebook, now filled with pages of memories, and wrote one final entry. We all carry scars, seen and unseen, but we also carry hope and the power to lift each other up. My story is just one among many, but together, our voices can heal the world. As dawn broke, Frank closed his notebook. Content: he had found peace not by forgetting the past, but by sharing it, by turning silence into strength, and by reminding others that even the quietest among us can leave the deepest mark.